Hello and welcome back to our Older Women's Rights Matter webinar, part 2. We are thrilled that you could join us. My name is Alana. I'm here from West Coast Leaf, and I'm joined by Krista James from the Canadian Centre for Elder Law. Hi, Krista.
Hello.
And we're also really lucky to have Sheila Sparks with us. Sheila Sparks is a family law lawyer with over 20 years of experience, and she practices on the North Shore, so she can help with some of our questions dealing with family law topics. Thanks for being with us today, Sheila.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
It'll be great to have you. So before we get started, we want to acknowledge the fact that we are broadcasting today from unceded Coast Salish territories belonging to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and also to encourage you to think about the territories where you do your own work. And we couldn't be doing this work today without funding from the BC Council to Reduce Elder Abuse. So thank you very much to our funder for making this possible today. So just a few technical notes that came up from the questions last time. Thanks very much for your excellent feedback. Some folks weren't totally sure how to navigate the GoToWebinar system. So we just wanted to point out there is a little hand icon that allows you to raise your hand, as well as a box for you to type questions. So we will allow some time for questions, but we'll keep it at the end, but we'll try to make sure to give lots of time for you to ask your questions. And just to do a little test now to see how we're doing in our tech side of things, if you can see the screen, you can see my PowerPoint, please raise your hand. Okay, lots of hands going up. That's really encouraging. Fantastic. Thank you. And if you could put your hands down. Next question, if you're able to hear me, can you hear the presentation? Okay, again, looking pretty good. So hope that folks can troubleshoot anything else. Sometimes it helps to plug in earphones with certain computers, and that might address the issue. So today's presentation is going to focus more on the financial side of safety for older women and also access to legal information, because these were some of the major themes that came out of our Older Women's Dialogue project. We talked about that project last time. We spoke to hundreds of older women about the law and policy issues that most impact their safety and well-being, and we heard loud and clear that these were really important issues. Financial insecurity was huge, so we know that it's really important to address legal topics that touch on women's access to financial resources in order to give them other options to get safe from an abusive situation. So here's one quotation from a participant to start us reflecting about the issues. Lack of work experience and financial dependency are highly gendered issues for many older women. And across many, and probably I would even say most cultures, there's quite a common expectation that women should perform unpaid caregiving and household duties and often place the needs of their family members or spouse ahead of their own needs. And that's a sexist expectation that can create at least two barriers to escaping abuse in the home. First of all, lack of financial resources and sometimes also limited experience in dealing with money. And also, of course, the stigma or shame associated with leaving. So just a bit of context about the project and what we're going to get to today. We'll do a very quick recap. And again, as I mentioned, talk about what older women shared with us about their experiences of income inequality and barriers to accessing legal information. And we'll get into some legal topics, including revoking powers of attorney and representation agreements, some basics of public pensions in Canada, property and pension division after separation, and other legal strategies to protect property and money in the context of abuse. And so the focus is more on financial topics today. We do know, of course, that financial and physical abuse are not separate. They often occur together, and of course, lack of access to money can really create challenges for a woman to escape physical violence. So it is a bit of an artificial distinction, but it was one way we were able to organize the information, so we hope you'll bear that in mind. Last time, just a quick review for those who couldn't join us, we did an overview of capacity and decision-making rights. We talked about protection orders and peace bonds as legal tools that could help older women seek safety from a dangerous person. Briefly touched on the role of the health authorities as designated agencies to respond to reports of abuse or neglect of adults who can't seek help for themselves. And we gave a brief intro to the role of the public guardian and trustee that we'll be expanding on today. So just a bit about the presenters. Krista's from the Canadian Centre for Elder Law. Did you want to speak about? Yeah.
Yeah, so the Canadian Centre for Elder Law is a national non-profit organization focused on law and policy issues that impact us as we age. Our work includes research, writing, and analysis for law reform, and we generally publish reports and studies on our website. We engage in collaboration with lots of different organizations and consultation with community groups around BC and Canada. And we develop materials to help people understand legal rights and responsibilities. Our tools are published on our website, and they can be downloaded for free. You'll find the URL for the CCL on the final slide of this presentation. Many of our recent project work has been focused on older women and abuse of older people, and this is a project that really brings those two subjects together. We were founded in about 12 years ago. We are based in Vancouver, and we form part of the British Columbia Law Institute, which is BC's non-partisan law reform agency for BC, although we do have a collaborator based out of Toronto. And we started as a bilingual agency, publishing materials mostly in English and French, but increasingly we're publishing tools and making them available on our website in a variety of languages. So if English isn't the language you work with, you might find some tools that are helpful to you in your practice.
Thanks, Krista. And a bit about West Coast LEAF. LEAF stands for Legal Education and Action Fund. We are the first and only organization in BC with a focus on advancing women's equality through the law, and there are 3 different ways we do that. One is through litigation, so actually getting involved in court cases as an intervener to provide an expert perspective on how the legal issue at stake impacts women and their safety and equality rights. Second is law reform, so research, writing, submissions to committees that are actually creating laws to try to shape the law to better protect women's equality. And finally, public legal education, so webinars and in-person workshops like the Older Women's Rights program that we've partnered with the Canadian Centre for Elder Law on. And our main focus is looking at changing systems to promote women's equality, but we do have one very new project that's quite exciting. We have partnered with Allard School of Law at UBC to open Rise Women's Legal Center, which is a low-cost, full-service legal clinic for women focusing on family law issues, and it's located in Vancouver. And for the contact information for Rise Women's Legal Center, you can visit our website, westcoastleaf.org. That will be provided at the end of the presentation as well. And there's information linked right from the home page about how you can get in touch with those folks, because it is pretty big news for access to justice for women in BC, so we're quite excited about that. The Older Women's Legal Education Project is a collaboration between the Canadian Centre for Elder Law and West Coast LEAF, and it involves 3 components. One is Roads to Safety. We're very excited to have published a 100-page plain language legal handbook touching on a lot of the different legal topics impacting older women, with recognition that those are overlapping issues in their lives and they may need a source of information that pulls together lots of topics in one place. And that's available on our website. I'll share the link in just a moment. Coming soon also in the next couple weeks is a wallet-sized resource with some sources of support for older women. That will be in 11 languages other than English, and that version lists only sources of support that are available multilingually. There will also be a general English version and a version specifically focused on services for Indigenous women. And lastly, the training that we're doing today. We have a workshop version as well as the webinar version, and we know that many older women find it much easier to navigate their legal options when they can talk to a trusted advocate or an ally in their community. So it's our hope that by sharing this information with you, we can make that information more available to older women as well. So we do encourage you to download our handbook. It's free. We will be printing a few print copies that we can distribute to organizations that serve older women. And please spread the word. We want everyone to make good use of this and know about this. So last time we touched on the Older Women's Dialogue Project. Just a brief refresher, we spoke to about 450 older women in 9 different languages to find out about the law and policy issues that were impacting their safety and well-being. And today we're just going to bring out a few themes from the insights that these women shared with us to help frame the discussion of the legal content. So one of the most common themes that emerged was about poverty and income insecurity. I think there's a stereotype that older folks are well off, but the research definitely does not bear out that assumption. In fact, a study by the Social Planning and Research Council of BC and the United Way shows that of women aged 65 and over just in the Lower Mainland, about 60% have an income under $25,000 and 8% under $10,000, and we did speak to women who actually had no income whatsoever. And interestingly, many women under 65 face particular challenges because they weren't eligible for old age security or many community programs and reduced fees for services for seniors. So briefly, some of the factors women identified as contributing to their financial insecurity. One could be immigration, which can affect access to pension, benefits, and publicly funded services, and of course the ability to find paid work when there can be a lack of recognition of credentials obtained in other countries, discrimination, language barriers, that kind of thing. Generally, women can't access OAS until they've been in Canada for 10 years. We'll touch on OAS later and explain more details about that. Disabilities and health issues can also be a factor due to barriers in accessing disability benefits. Employment discrimination, which can include pressure to retire early, or inability to work or work full-time, depending on the type of disability. Access to pensions was huge. That's one of the reasons we're talking about that today. And in particular, many Indigenous women really focused on the fact that it wasn't until 1988 that people earning income on reserve became entitled to contribute to the CPP and start to accrue benefits for the first time. So obviously a huge source of inequality. This basically means that a woman who's 65 years old today and had a career on reserve would have been 38 before she could start contributing to CPP, so creating a huge gap there. Also for some immigrant women, if a work history is split between countries, that could also limit pension entitlement depending on the social security agreement between particular countries and Canada, which we'll talk about more later as well. We know that caregiving responsibilities can be highly gendered and can limit workforce participation rather, and impact women's financial situation. For example, many women were raising grandchildren and talked about the lack of financial and other supports available to them, just to give one of many examples. Discrimination also is huge in employment based on factors including gender, age, race, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and many more, and all of those in combination, of course. Queer and lesbian older women in the Older Women's Dialogue Project emphasize the fact that a lesbian woman who's 65 today spent 45 years of her life without legal protection from workplace discrimination based on her sexual orientation, which could really affect her financial situation and her career over many years. And many women sort of described employers not valuing them, not recognizing their skills and experience, cutting their hours and giving their hours instead to younger workers, pressuring them to take fewer hours to not pay benefits and things like that. And discrimination isn't just in the workplace, but also other public institutions where women turn for support and financial supports in particular. For example, one woman said, "Every time I come to the welfare office, I'm made to feel like a criminal, especially when they hear my accent." And another woman said, "The income assistance, people ask you to wait outside in the name of safety and security, but end up treating people with a lot of disrespect." And one other source of discrimination that can have an impact on women's financial security is the stigma associated with being a survivor of violence, which often is not discussed even in circles where there's a strong awareness of different kinds of discrimination. But as this participant in the Older Women's Dialogue Project pointed out, that can affect credit rating and all kinds of things. The other theme we'll touch on today is lack of access to information, and especially legal information, because the legal information surrounding pensions and other financial aspects can be quite difficult to navigate, even for a native English speaker, even for a trained lawyer in some cases. So it's important to think about making that information more readily accessible. There can be language barriers. Sometimes women pointed out that there's a lack of plain language written information in their native language, but of course other women pointed out that they don't read in any language, and that's not a useful way for them to get information, so they need help from advocates who speak their language. Accessibility is huge. Lack of access to sign language interpretation and services by text messaging was reported as a significant issue for women from the deaf community and hard of hearing community, especially in terms of healthcare, but also others. Print-based resources can create barriers for women with low vision or who are blind, or for women with dementia or intellectual disabilities. So yes, and although there is plain language information often available online for women fleeing violence, the internet is not accessible to lots of older women, and compared to younger women, they may be less likely to access a computer or feel confident in using one. Another point we heard about was sometimes service providers have ageist attitudes and will actually provide information about a woman's financial situation or health situation or something else very personal to her to a younger person, the daughter or the grandson, instead of to the woman herself, just because of ageism. And in lack of access to legal information, cost was identified as the #1 barrier. Even when women could access a free or low-cost 30-minute legal advice session, very often that was not enough time, especially when interpretation had to be factored in, which could make things much slower. And Indigenous women faced unique barriers in accessing legal assistance because legal issues on reserve can be quite complex. Either provincial or federal jurisdiction may apply, and there aren't a lot of lawyers who practice and have expertise in this area of law in the Vancouver Lower Mainland, creating yet another barrier. So just to summarize the insights from Older Women's Dialogue Project, both last time and today, many older women pointed out that it's so important to remember that older women's experiences, and whether those are relating to safety, financial security, access to information, access to justice, or anything else, aren't just shaped by gender and age discrimination, but by discrimination based on many aspects of their identity in combination. And it's important for us to think about how to meet older women's needs to access a system that in many ways hasn't been built to include them. So this really touches on the idea of intersectionality, which is quite a popular term in conversations about feminism and violence against women. This term is often credited to Kimberly Crenshaw, an American legal scholar. But of course, as we saw from the last slide, there are many, many women who have made these observations that all aspects of our identity combine to shape our experiences and create layers of injustice or discrimination. So you'll notice that the word elder abuse is in quotation marks on this slide. And to be clear, this is definitely not because we doubt the reality of violence against older adults, far from it, but because each older adult also has other identities that could be relevant to the experience of violence. So an older woman is also a woman, and she may also be a newcomer to Canada, and she may also be a person with a disability, and so on. And all of these factors would affect her experience trying to get help to escape violence in her home and navigate the legal system. And another interesting point is this is an image that I found just by Google image searching intersectionality. And what's missing from this graphic? It's pretty obvious in the context of today's session that, you know, lots of factors are listed: marital status, income, language, culture, and so on, but age is missing. So even in feminist conversations where there's an awareness of different aspects of identity, often there's not an awareness of age discrimination and aging as a reality that shapes people's lives. So those were the sorts of realities we tried to focus on in our Roads to Safety handbook, as well as in this workshop. Concerns like, if I leave my sponsor, will I be deported? And what will happen to my grandkids if an older woman is the one who's caring for those grandkids? Or fears about reporting abuse to the police, given the history of colonial violence and negative experiences that a woman may have had with the criminal justice system, which would be, of course, very understandable. Sexist assumptions that women aren't good with money can combine with ageism, can combine with ableism as well. If a woman, for example, has had a stroke and has partial facial paralysis, to really create barriers to her having access to the money that's rightfully hers and have her decision-making rights respected. So with that as sort of a frame for the issues, I'm going to hand it over to Krista to unpack some of the legal topics.
Thanks, Alana. So this week we are starting with a review of legal issues with a discussion of substitute decision makers. When we consulted with frontline service providers during the development of the handbook, substitute decision making was one of the topics of greatest interest. And I will be spending the most time, in terms of all the slides I'm going through today, the most time on this particular slide. And I think as Alana introduced this PowerPoint, she said, the focus of this presentation is financial safety. And although that is true, just in terms of talking about substitute decision makers and the different types in BC, we are touching on other kinds of substitute decision makers as well, as you can see from this slide. So one of the other reasons why we cover substitute decision makers in this presentation is because often abuse of older women will involve misuse of authority under a substitute decision instrument. Now there are 4 main different kinds of substitute decision makers in BC, and they're listed on this slide. I'm just going to go through them quickly. So a power of attorney is a document that gives authority to an individual called an attorney, not meaning a lawyer, and powers of attorney can cover legal and financial decisions only. A representation agreement gives authority to someone we refer to as a representative. And these documents can cover health and personal care decisions and sometimes also routine financial matters. You can also find in BC there are temporary healthcare decision makers. I talk about them in more detail in another slide, but these are basically folks who get temporary authority. They are selected by a healthcare provider in a very emergent context or a context where someone can't consent to healthcare themselves. Maybe they're unconscious or they don't have a brain injury it's depriving them of mental capacity temporarily. And also in BC we have committee. Now committee, the word you would hear in other jurisdictions is guardian. Committee is a person who is appointed by a judge to make decisions for another person as a result of an application to the court. So this wouldn't happen unless someone is actually applying to the court and saying, I want to have authority for my mother, my sister, for a person's decisions for health or finance because they do not have mental capacity any longer. For representation agreements, it's worth noting that there are different scope of powers can relate to whether they were created under Section 7 or Section 9 of the Representation Agreement Act, and they're sometimes called either Section 7 RAs or Section 9 RAs, or they might be called standard or non-standard, and I'm not going to go into detail about the distinctions there, and neither does the guide, but if you look at the legislation, it's fairly clear about the differences between Section 7 and Section 9, and that's the Representation Agreement Act of BC. It's important for both service providers and older women to know that having a substitute decision maker in place does not necessarily mean that the person has the legal ability to make all decisions on behalf of a woman or an older woman in particular, since that's what we're focused on today. Not everyone is aware of the details of the law in this area, and even we find staff at major institutions like banks or the healthcare system can actually be confused about the law. And one example of this is we have heard stories where someone is kind of waiving a power of attorney and they are making healthcare decisions for someone in a healthcare facility when, of course, as we just discussed, powers of attorney cannot cover healthcare decision making. So abuse can happen when a substitute decision maker misuses their authority or oversteps it. For many women, it can be a very empowering first step to take a look at the legal document that creates a substitute decision-making relationship, or look at the relevant law and identify exactly what powers it does and doesn't give. It's important to also note that these substitute decision-making relationships relate to what happens when a woman is living and have nothing to do with wills, which cover what happens after her death. You'll find that a substitute decision maker could be a person, might be a spouse or an adult child, or it could be a professional advisor, like a lawyer or a notary. Could be a corporate trustee, such as a trust company, or an authorized agency, such as the Bloom Group in Vancouver, and then they're taking a fee for their services. Or it could be the public guardian trustee in specific situations. Now, what powers in particular does a substitute decision maker have? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on what it says in the legal document that created the substitute decision making relationship, and it also depends on the relevant law. If the powers have been created in BC, it could be created via an agreement. Now, a power of attorney and a representation agreement are both kinds of agreement, so you're voluntarily giving powers by signing this agreement. It could be by a court order, as in the case of a committee, the guardian we just discussed, or it could be a certificate of incapability. In those contexts, the decision maker would be the public guardian and trustee as a statutory property guardian. Now, substitute decision makers can be very powerful, and I'll just give you a couple of examples of some kinds of powers they can have, but they're discussed in more detail in the guide. Could be receiving or depositing or spending a pension check. Could deal with healthcare treatments such as surgery. And if you're dealing with a Section 9 representation agreement, it can deal with pretty invasive decisions around how a person lives their lives, ranging from where the person lives to whether they can have a driver's license, or even whether certain kinds of restraints can be used on them in a care facility. So substitute decision-making documents are very powerful. Now looking at the next slide, Alana, if we're dealing with healthcare decisions, just to get this straight as being different from financial decisions, you might have a representative, you might have a committee of the person, or you might have a temporary substitute decision maker. I think we introduced all those terms just a moment ago. With a representative or created under a representation agreement, it's important to note that that could mean that the representative has authority to make decisions for the older woman. It might mean she has authority to help make decisions and to not make decisions for her. Or it might mean that the substitute decision maker will get authority to make decisions for her in the event that the older woman becomes too ill or disabled to make her own decisions. So a representation agreement can be a kind of just-in-case document or a form of advanced planning for healthcare decision making. In terms of temporary substitute decision makers, if you want to know more about who might be appointed as this temporary substitute decision maker, I encourage you to look at the Healthcare Consent and Consent to Treatment Act. It basically lists in descending order the people who might be appointed as your substitute decision maker if you're not in a position to make decisions for yourself and you don't have a representative or a committee who has been given that authority. So the legislation lists this list in descending order. You're starting with spouse and adult children and going down the line. It's important to note that if you have not talked to a person in a year and you're estranged, that person shouldn't be put in place as your substitute decision maker temporarily, even although in a healthcare emergent context, the treating individual may not have all the details about your situation in mind. But if you're advocating for a woman who is in hospital, her abuser should not be her temporary substitute decision maker, and the healthcare provider should be provided with information to help them determine who in that list should be the substitute decision maker for help temporarily until other person can be appointed. Now, just by way of larger context, it's important to note that in emergencies, if you're unconscious, impaired by drugs or alcohol, a healthcare provider can provide healthcare to preserve life, prevent serious harm, or treat severe pain without contacting anyone. And this again is set out in the Healthcare Consent and Consent to Treatment Act. Moving on to the next slide. There are rights that are enshrined in legislation if you have a substitute decision maker. So this slide states 3 very key rights that now have been written explicitly into a law. So even if a person has a substitute decision maker that's been put in place to make decisions for them, they still have this duty to consult with you before making a decision on your behalf, where it's physically possible. They have a duty to follow known instructions or wishes. And they have a duty to make decisions in your best interests, or if you're representing an older woman, in her best interests. A substitute decision maker does not have the authority to do anything they want. And one point of clarification I find it's often important to make is a representation agreement, a power of attorney, these are not a form of early inheritance. A substitute decision maker is always making decisions for you, dealing with your finances in your best interests. They are not doing things for themselves. Although that's where we see financial abuse by way of a substitute decision-making relationship is often when folks ignore or have forgotten about this distinction. So moving on to the next slide, looking at substitute decision-making and abuse. It's important to note that substitute decision-making, an abuse of authority under a substitute decision-making agreement is not just a personal conflict. It can actually be a crime under the criminal law. And so this slide contains some examples. So using a substitute decision-making instrument like a power of attorney or a representation agreement to take a woman's money, pressuring or forcing a person to sign an agreement, and this happens a lot in the context of older adults. This again, could be a crime. Neglect of a woman's health care by a guardian or care provider where the woman is in a dependency situation, again, this can be a crime under the criminal code. And failure to fulfill any other legal responsibilities could be a criminal act. And police who are not familiar with power of attorney abuse may not know the law in this area. It is a fairly specialized area of criminal law. You may find if they present on the scene, if they're not used to this area, they may say, oh, it's a family issue, we can't really get involved. It can sometimes be useful to remind the attending officer that theft through a power of attorney is a specific crime under Canadian law. And if you'd like more information about what kinds of crimes might be engaged in the context of abuse of an older woman or elder abuse, you can take a look at a tool that we published online a number of years ago. It's called the Practical Guide to Elder Abuse and Neglect Law in Canada. It's pretty long. You can download it for free from our website, and we are in the process of updating it and hopefully launching it as a wiki book within the next year. Looking on to the following slide where we talk about revoking and canceling powers of attorney and representation agreements. We find that it's really important for women to know that as long as they have legal capacity, and when I say legal capacity, I mean the ability to make your own decisions, they can cancel, the legal term is revoke, a power of attorney or a representation agreement. Often women are led to believe that once they sign these documents, that's it. They've given away all their decision-making rights and they can't do anything, but that is generally not true. The legal requirement for capacity to create a new power of attorney versus revoke it could be different in a particular context depending on how complex a woman's situation is. So she might sometimes be able to get rid of the power of attorney, get rid of the authority of the attorney, or RA, but not create a new one. But there are a number of steps that must be taken if a woman wants to revoke her power of attorney or representation agreement. It's not enough just to decide. And communicating the decision is just as important as taking the decision. So this slide lists some key steps to take, including, if it is safe, informing the attorney or the representative. You need to notify others. So a good example of this is the bank. So if there's a power of attorney in place and the attorney has been going to the bank and making transactions on your behalf, if you don't tell the bank that the power of attorney has been revoked, they will keep acting as if the power of attorney is still in place. So it's important to notify the right organizations and individual that authority has been revoked. And this slide includes some relevant organizations and individuals, including key family members, the bank, Revenue Canada, and Service Canada, especially if there's a pension involved. We encourage you to check with NIDIS if you're helping a woman with a power of attorney or representation agreement. So the NIDIS Personal Planning Resource Center and Registry, this is a BC organization that provides information and does teaching around these agreements, and a woman could have registered her agreement with NIDIS. If that's done, the NIDIS also needs to be contacted regarding any change, including revoking one of these documents. The power of attorney or representation agreement could set up some steps that might need to be taken to make the revocation effective. So be sure to read all the fine print of the document. Moving on to the next slide, and looking a little more at abuse and neglect and how we can intervene to support a woman who's experiencing abuse if she's not in an ability to protect herself. Now, in the last week, we talked a lot about the designated agencies under the Adult Guardianship Act. So these are organizations that have the authority to intervene and take steps to help protect a woman or any adult if she is experiencing abuse or neglect and does not have capacity to act for herself. Now, today we're going to talk a little bit more about the way public guardian trustee can get involved, specifically in the context of financial abuse. Now, one of the resources we introduced last week in the presentation was called the Decision Tree, which has been published by the Public Guardian Trustee. It talks about the steps, the actions various authorities will take in a context of elder abuse. There's a column for RCMP and police, a column for health authorities, and there is a column for Public Guardian Trustee. And that tool gives you lots of details about steps that Public Guardian Trustee can or will take. And I'm going to go through a few of them in a little more detail today. So looking at the following slide, it's important to recognize at the beginning that the power of attorney, the Public Guardian Trustee does not have authority to intervene in any context of financial abuse. Very importantly, they have to believe that there is no mental capacity. This is part of the limits on their scope of authority. So the woman has to have an inability to make her own decisions, and this could be due to an illness or a disease of the mind. She must have assets that are at risk. Any amount at risk, it could be a small pension versus an enormous estate. The total value of the estate is not the issue, it's just that their assets are at risk. And there has to be no one else who's going to help her. The Public Guardian Trustee will take a number of steps if they believe that there is financial abuse and there's no mental capacity, there's abuse of authority of a financial decision maker. They may interview the woman, her spouse, family members, other folks to find out what is going on to get a broader picture. They can obtain reports from various organizations and institutions, including banks, healthcare providers. They can do sort of collateral interviews with key folks in the community to help understand what's going on in a particular situation. In terms of looking at the following slide, in terms of the powers of the Public Guardian Trustee, they have fairly broad powers if their authority does apply. They can ask a substitute decision maker, like a representative or attorney or a guardian, a committee, to make a report demonstrating how the assets are being spent and managed, how income is being managed. They can obtain reports from financial institutions. They can require trustees, attorneys, representatives, guardians to produce any accounts. And they do, in some situations, have the power to temporarily freeze assets. So this would protect assets from being spent in a kind of emergency context. The power of attorney can take on financial and legal decision making for a fee in certain contexts, but the actual investigation that they do as part of their mandate to investigate abuse, that they do without charging a fee. Sometimes if a woman's only income is a kind of disability pension or OAS, the Public Guardian Trustee will act as a pension trustee in places not served by the Bloom Group. Now the Bloom Group, contact information for them, and their role is listed in the resources section of the Roads to Safety. Now legal issues surrounding the management of women's money are fairly fundamental to safety, and so on this presentation we're also going to look a little bit about pensions as well. So the next few slides deal with pensions. As most of you are aware, women will often be reluctant to leave an abusive situation if she's thinking, how will I support myself? Where will I live? And I think this can be particularly true of older women who've been in a same relationship for a significant period of time. explaining rights to old age security and Canada Pension Plan benefits can be quite crucial to well-being and to the comfort to leaving an abusive situation. So old age security, it's available, understand it's available to most people over the age of 65. You can postpone it to age 70 and receive an increased monthly benefit. There's no relationship to paid work history. So OAS is based on entitlement linked to age. The guaranteed income supplement, now this is an additional extra that old age security recipients can receive if they meet low income criteria. So it basically increases the amount of their OAS. Now thirdly, in terms of public pensions, we have the Canada Pension Plan. Now compared to old age security, now this is a plan you pay into based on work history and employer contributions, and the amount that a person receives is very much tied to how much they paid into it over their experience of work, subject to the following two slides. It's standard to start getting the pension at age 65, although it is possible to receive it earlier and then you get a reduced pension. It's important to be aware that with CPP you could be talking about other kinds of pension benefits. So CPP still does also have the disability benefits plan for adults with a severe and prolonged disability, and there's an application process to apply for those benefits. There also are survivor benefits attached to CPP. If a woman is receiving CPP disability benefits under the age of 65, she might also be entitled to an additional benefit to help support a grandchild or underage child that she has care and control of. There's much more detail on pensions in the Roads to Safety Guide, but just a basic point is probably worth mentioning is that entitlement to old age security is also very much tied to residency. So in order to be entitled to any old age security, a woman must have lived in Canada as an adult for at least 10 years, and to be entitled to the full OAS, you need to have been in Canada as an adult for 40 years. If you have been in Canada for less than the 48 years, you're receiving a prorated pension based on how long you've been in Canada. Now, looking at, I mentioned there are a couple provisions in the CPP regime to enhance equity, and so these two provisions are discussed on this slide here. So one is the child rearing provision. It basically allows that your pension can be, your monthly premiums can be adapted based on if you have years where a child is under 7 and your earning potential is less, you can apply to have these years excluded from your calculation, and this will likely result in a slight increase in pension. It is also important for women leaving an abusive situation to know about credit splitting. CPP contributions made by a woman and her spouse may be equally split after divorce or separation. Again, a woman has to apply for this, and there's a form to fill out to make that application. Details on that are available in the Roads to Safety. Just a few words about private pensions. The pension of an ex-spouse can be a valuable asset, but the law surrounding pension division is extremely complicated, and we're not able to say too much about this in this PowerPoint. So there's some further information in the Roads to Safety Handbook. We always encourage women to get legal help in this area because of the complexity. Different types of pensions have different rules, and so we talked about CPP and OAS in the previous slide. Now, private pensions would include things like RRSPs, RRIFs, and work-related pensions. A work-related pension could be a kind of family property. Now, we talked in the previous PowerPoint presentation last week about family property. Generally, property accrued after the relationship started is considered to be equally owned, so subject 50-50 split upon separation. So pensions accrued through employment can fall into this. It's not a sort of hard and fast rule, so women need to get more information about the pension involved. There is a form that a woman can fill out that is available on the LSS, the Legal Service Society website, called a claim and request for information and notice on pensions, and it goes to a pension plan administrator. There's information in the guide on how to get that form and help a woman to fill it out. Be aware that not all private pensions are family property, so it really is useful to get advice from a lawyer if at all possible. Now, just at the end of this presentation, we wanted to highlight a few resources that are particularly helpful to older women who are fleeing abuse and in fact underutilized. So the BC Centre for Elder Advocacy and Support has a toll-free line. It's listed on this slide here. They provide both victim services and they have an elder law clinic. So it's a useful site in terms of one-stop shopping. A woman can get emotional support, referrals to services, and legal advice all kind of in one place. I also think it's important to let folks know that there are specific elder abuse police units. So, and this applies to Vancouver and New West. If you're contacting the police and it's a context of abuse of an older woman or family relationship, it might be useful to try and contact the elder abuse police unit. They'll send a team that involves a social worker as well as a police detective. And they have a lot of experience liaising with public guardian trustee, designated agencies, and other service organizations in Vancouver. The last two slides include some community organizations that we highlight in our handbook, so I don't think I really need them to go into them in too much detail in the interest of leaving some time at the end of this presentation for questions. So maybe, Alana, let's just skip to ahead to the final slide on page 34 there.
This slide, Krista?
Yeah, so this slide has contact information for both Alana and myself and info on how to reach the Canadian Centre for Elder Law and West Coast Leaf, how to find us on Twitter and Facebook and other places.